Part 35. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 341. At this time, He Liu looked like what the Earth-split bear and white tiger had said, and it was not what he looked like. After a while, the white tiger also sighed heavily, with a wry smile on his lips. I don't know when the second season of the Otherworld Adventure live broadcast will be launched. Now that I stay here every day, all the bones in my body are loose. Earthshatter Bear also sighed heavily, with a wry smile on his lips. It's okay for you. I've really been relegated to the cold palace. Alas, after all, the space barrier of the space-time beast and these space-time level skills are simply awesome. He looks very handsome, and it's very elegant and it's normal to be reused. Although this Earth Splitter Bear looks honest, his words are indeed quite sour. At this moment, the white tiger hugged the earth-shattering bear. Don't be discouraged, keep playing cards. After the time and space beast appeared at this time, the 6 ghost dogs rushed towards Lin Yu at the same time. Obviously, the man in the suit thought that he must have won this time, and the smile on his face became darker than before. A lot more arrogant. But the next scene almost shocked his jaw. The moment the space beast appeared, an invisible space barrier blocked Lin Yu's face. Then, the 6 ghost dogs directly hit one's head and broke his blood. At this moment, the space-time beast became very playful. It did not rush to kill first, but slowly relied on the power of time and space to completely confine the 6 ghost dogs in a small space. It looked like they were raised the same as 6 pet dogs. At this time, the man in the suit and the remaining Netherworld 6 were there. After seeing this scene, they were shocked and stunned. At this time, their eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. The corners of their eyes and eyebrows there was a look of complete disbelief in it. How is this possible? How can this kid be so scary? This is absolutely impossible. What is going on? Their eyes were fixed directly on Lin Yu, and there was a look of complete disbelief in the corners of their eyes and brows. When Lin Yu saw this scene, a sarcastic smile appeared on his lips, and then he suddenly took a step forward. How's it going? Are you satisfied with my reception? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the man in the suit, and at this moment, the man in the suit suddenly started to shed cold sweat on his forehead. The man in the suit stared straight at Lin Yu, with a wry smile on his lips. Just now, I was blind to the truth, and I hope you can be noble and let me go. The man in the suit bowed respectfully to Lin Yu, his eyes and brows filled with a sense of complete submission. At this time, Lin Yu also had a sneer on his lips. Let you go? But looking at what you just said, you didn't mean to let me go. Since you don't intend to let me go, then tell me, why should I let you go? Lin Yu's eyes were burning like a torch, and the corners of his eyes and brows were full of a gloomy meaning, and his murderous aura became more and more obvious. At this time, the man in the suit felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave. His back was completely wet with cold sweat in an instant, and then he fell to his knees on the ground. Please, please let me go. I don't want to cause trouble to you. This matter. The man in the suit paused when he said this, as if he had remembered something terrible and did not dare to continue talking. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what the man in the suit said, he slowly walked up to the man in the suit, and stared at the man in the suit with a smile on his face, and the corners of his mouth curled up a few times. Very sneer. Don't be ridiculous. I don't understand. How do you think I will let you go? Besides, you were not like this before. Weren't you very arrogant before? After the man in the suit heard what Lin Yu said, a special color flashed in his eyes, and then a layer of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He swallowed a mouthful of saliva, and there was also a layer of saliva on the corner of his mouth. It evoked a bit of a wry smile. This. What is this? You should tell me. Do you have anything that can buy your life? If so, I might be able to spare your life if I am in a good mood. If not, then just go ahead. Die. Lin Yu said in a calm and cold voice, and a layer of dense cold sweat instantly appeared on the forehead of the man in the suit, and a wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. At this time, the man in the suit began to think back so hard, and Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on him. The cold sweat flowed down the forehead of the man in the suit. The man in the suit also had a forced smile on his lips, and there was a look of helplessness in the corners of his eyes and brows. He just opened his mouth to say the word I. Lin Yu, then turned back and glared at him fiercely. After a moment, the man in the suit seemed to have grabbed the straw that saved his life, as if he remembered something, and a bit of excitement flashed across his face. I remember. If you remember, just say it quickly. You know, I hate those guys who drag their feet. The corner of the man in the suit's mouth also raised a bit of bitter smile. The reason why we came back is entirely because the guy we just caught is not the real bar owner. The real bar owner should have escaped now, or is still in this bar and has not fallen into our hands. The 6 sons of the netherworld heard the man in the suit and looked at each other after saying this. In the depths of their eyes, there was obviously a flash of fear, and at this time, there was a flash of strange colors in their eyes. At this moment, after Lin Yu heard what the man in the suit said, a sneer appeared on the corner of his mouth. Then he turned his head and stared at the man in the suit, with a strange look in his eyes and eyebrows. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 342. Are you telling the truth? The man in the suit nodded his head like a chicken pecking at rice, with a firm look in his eyes. It's true, I dare not tell you this half a lie. The man in the suit stared at Lin Yu, and Lin Yu nodded and smiled gently at this time, then walked to the man in the suit and gently helped him up. Don't be so excited. Why are you so excited? I won't do anything to you. Get up quickly. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the man in the suit also nodded and smiled, but at this moment, his face was quite unnatural. At this time, Lin Yu just turned his head and looked at the space-time beast. Kill these puppies after playing enough. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the space-time beast also nodded his head gently, and then everyone heard a huge bang. Finally, these nether dogs exploded into blood mist in an instant. The 6 nether sons let out a low roar, and then a mouthful of blood spurted out of their mouths. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu couldn't help but shook his head and smiled. I hate people who bully others by taking advantage of their power. Today I just teach you a small lesson. If there is a next time in the future, don't blame me for being rude. When Lin Yu finished speaking, his tone instantly became gloomy and cold. At this moment, they naturally didn't dare to refute anything, and they just nodded in succession. Lin Yu turned his head towards them, just glanced coldly, and then waved his hand casually. Okay, you can go now. After hearing what Lin Yu said, those people turned around and crawled away, not daring to look back. After seeing them like this, Lin Yu just shook his head casually, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. Trash, damn trash. Lin Yu's voice was quite low. At this time, several figures suddenly walked out from a distance, and those figures directly blocked them. At this time, when those people saw these people coming later, some strange colors flashed in their eyes. You are. The man in the suit hadn't finished speaking, and then a cold light cut his throat directly. A woman, to be precise, a very beautiful woman, a little too beautiful, walked towards the house with a charming and coquettish step. Lin Yu seemed to have sensed the presence of this woman. At this time, his face was slightly condensed, and a bit of gloom flashed in his eyes. Originally, Lin Yu had just walked to Susan's side and wanted to pick up Susan to find the boss. If he guessed correctly, the boss must still be in the bar. There must be a dark room in the bar. Now all he needs to do is find this dark room. At this time, the appearance of the woman was quite unexpected to Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu slowly turned his head and looked at the woman. The woman also looked at Lin Yu, and the corners of her mouth raised a few meaningful smiles. Seeing is believing. I didn't expect Mr. Lin to be so young. This really caught me off guard. After hearing what the woman said, Lin Yu was also slightly stunned at first, but after a moment, he waved his hand casually. This lady has an extraordinary aura. I think she has something to ask me this time. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the woman nodded and smiled gently. Sir, you are really smart. I really have something to ask you this time. I want to ask you for help. I don't know if you agree or not. At this moment, Lin Yu suddenly smiled. What do you want me to do for you? Tell me, I'm deciding whether to agree or not. The two of them looked at each other like this. After a moment, the woman covered her face and giggled. The woman walked straight to Lin Yu. Her every move, every frown and smile was like a fairy, exuding a mature and intellectual charm all the time. At this time, even Lin Yu had to admit that the charming temperament of this woman really made him a little intoxicated. The woman didn't seem to be afraid of Lin Yu. She slowly walked to Lin Yu's side and breathed softly in Lin Yu's ear. The hot air penetrated into Lin Yu's ears, making Lin Yu's mind sway. At this time, Lin Yu's face was slightly condensed, and then he took several steps back. His eyes were staring at the woman, and his eyebrows seemed to be twisted together. I hope you can respect yourself. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the woman couldn't help but giggled. She said softly, then how do you hope I can respect myself? Lin Yu saw the woman in front of him as if she were a fairy, and there was a flash of strange colors in her eyes. A moment later, the woman suddenly took a few steps back. She just shook her head and smiled. You are a very interesting man. At this moment, Lin Yu's face was slightly condensed, and then he waved his hand lightly. Thank you for the compliment, lady. You are also a very interesting woman, but I don't like such a roundabout woman. The woman seemed to understand what Lin Yu meant. At this time, her expression became rational, and she was a little more serious than before. Actually, I came to you this time just to talk about cooperation with you. Lin Yu's face was slightly condensed, and then he turned his head and looked at the woman, with a flash of special colors in his eyes. Talk about cooperation with me? I don't think there is any cooperation between the two of us. What do you think? There was a flash of coldness in Lin Yu's eyes. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 343. At this time, the woman suddenly smiled. She just waved lightly, and then walked to Lin Yu's side and breathed softly in Lin Yu's ear. Really? Do you really think there is nothing to talk about between the two of us? That would really hurt someone's heart. This woman pretended to be charming, but she didn't show any affectation at all. Lin Yu's expression suddenly froze, his eyes were fixed on the woman's body, and then he pulled out the woman's hand holding his arm without any trace. Now before I get angry and change my mind, you'd better leave quickly, otherwise don't blame me for being rude. Lin Yu said in a cold voice, with a gloomy meaning between the corners of his eyes and the tips of his brows. This gloomy meaning even made women feel a little shuddering. After waiting for this moment, the woman returned to her previous aloof appearance, her eyes staring directly at Lin Yu. You are indeed a very special man, you are different from other men. At this time, Lin Yu smiled softly, then turned his head and glanced at the woman. Thank you for the compliment. I don't have anything in my hand either. I know that the bar owner is hiding in this bar now. The map in the bar owner's hand is just a fragmented map, so even if you get the fragmented map it's no use. After Lin Yu heard what the woman said, his expression suddenly froze, and then he turned his head and glanced towards the woman. A special color flashed in his eyes. What do you mean by that? The woman gently spread her hands and smiled, staring at Lin Yu with a smile on her face, and a charming smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. Isn't it obvious what I mean? The reason why I say this is of course because I have the other half of the map. At this moment, after Lin Yu heard what the woman said, his expression suddenly froze, and then his eyes were fixed on the woman's body, with a bit of disbelief in his eyes. The woman seemed to be aware of Lin Yu's suspicion. She just spread her hands gently and smiled. You don't believe what I said is true? I would have a hard time believing what you said until I saw that half of the map. After the woman heard what Lin Yu said, she also shook her head. We know your abilities well and have a photographic memory. If you see the map, you will soon be able to find the map with that fragment. It's the ancient battlefield of the gods, and we're not fools, are we? At this moment, after Lin Yu heard the woman say this, he couldn't help but shook his head and smiled. What a smart woman. If that's the case, then fine, let's talk openly between the two of us. What do you think? The woman nodded slightly, indicating her agreement. Your purpose is very simple. There should be something you want in this ancient battlefield of the gods. It is not difficult to get me to agree to cooperate, but I don't want my partner to hide anything from me. Tell me what you are doing. What do you want? Lin Yu's eyes stared directly at the woman, with a gloomy look flashing in his eyes. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the woman at this moment was slightly stunned at first, but after waiting for a moment, she nodded gently. There is really nothing I can do about you. Since you want to know, then it's not impossible to tell you, but what? Tell me. But you must not be able to snatch what we want from us. What we want is not much. In this ancient battlefield, it is just the same. What? Thor's hammer. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what the woman said, a bit of surprise flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Originally, he thought that Thor's hammer only existed in the legend, but now it seems that it does not exist in the legend. Not so. At this moment, Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the woman in front of him. After hesitating for a moment, he nodded lightly. No problem, I can promise you. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the woman at this moment also nodded and smiled. Okay, then I won't rob you of this bar owner this time. I also know that I can't rob you. He should. Now you are still in this bar, consider this a meeting gift from me. After the woman finished speaking, she turned around and left. The woman also knew very well how terrifying Lin Yu's true strength was. In their entire organization, unless they reach the level of Black and White Deacon, they may be able to barely fight Lin Yu. Similar to their current level, wanting to fight Lin Yu is simply a dream. When the woman thought of this, she couldn't help but shook her head slightly and smiled. Of course, Lin Yu could see this woman's thoughts. It's really nice to give such a smooth favor. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he walked forward like this. At this time, Susan had a bit of fear on her face, as if she had a nightmare. Lin Yu felt quite sorry when he saw Susan like this. He just shook his head, sighed, and then gently rubbed Susan's head. Alas, what a poor child, I don't know what kind of nightmare she had. At this time, Susan suddenly grabbed Lin Yu's wrist, and then sat up in shock. Her face was full of panic, and her snow-white face instantly turned pale. No, no. Susan was talking incoherently. When Lin Yu heard Susan say this, he walked to Susan's side, and then gently held the little girl in his arms and gently rubbed her head. At this time, Susan also felt Lin Yu's presence, and then she slowly raised her head. When she saw Lin Yu's sharp profile, she felt as if there was a little deer in her heart, beating wildly. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 344. At this time, Susan was stunned for a while before she came back to her senses, and then she gently pushed Lin Yu away. At this time, a few touches of crimson appeared on Susan's pretty face, and her green look was as pure and attractive as the green apple. But after a while, Susan took a deep breath, calmed down her mood a little, and the expression on her face returned to what it was before, completely different from before. "What did you dream about just now? Why are you so scared?" Lin Yu's eyes were staring directly at Susan, with a hint of concern in his eyes. At this time, after Susan heard what Lin Yu said, she took a deep breath, but even so, the look of panic on her face was still very obvious. "Oh, I don't know why just now. I just dreamed of a man holding a hammer. That man was covered in thunder spots and kept chasing me in a desert. I ran as hard as I could, and the man kept chasing me. In the end I almost got caught by him, and then I woke up." At this time, Susan seemed to have something that she had not said. Lin Yu saw that Susan's expression was quite unnatural. However, at this time, he just smiled like this and did not say anything. "Say something more." "It's okay, it's just a dream." Susan shook her head. "If it was just such a simple dream, I wouldn't take it to heart at all, but this dream doesn't seem to be simple." Lin Yu's brows sank slightly, and he turned his head and glanced at Susan, with a special color flashing in his eyes. "Oh, so have you had other similar dreams?" Susan nodded lightly, and then slowly sat up. She turned her head and glanced at Lin Yu, a bit of complexity flashed in her eyes. "Although this was the first time I was chased by this man with a hammer, I had been chased countless times in the same place before. Every night was almost a nightmare, so many times I can't even sleep." After Susan finished speaking, a look of desolation clearly flashed across her face. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but feel distressed for a while. At this time, he pretended to be relaxed. He turned his head, glanced at Susan and smiled. "It's okay, everything will be fine." After Susan heard what Lin Yu said, she turned her head and glanced in his direction, with a wry smile on her lips. "Then do you think everything will really get better?" Susan's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. Lin Yu was also slightly stunned at first, but after a moment, he walked directly in front of Susan and gently rubbed Susan's little head. A bit of doting flashed in his eyes. "Trust me, everything will be fine." At this time, after Susan heard Lin Yu say this, she nodded slightly, and a bit of tenderness suddenly appeared between the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. "I really want to thank you this time." At this time, Lin Yu was a little confused by Susan's behavior. He just smiled and said, "You're welcome, but now doesn't seem to be the time to talk about this. We have to find the bar owner quickly." "That's it?" Susan's face darkened slightly, and a bit of confusion flashed in her eyes. "Bar owner? Isn't the bar owner missing long ago?" Susan turned her head and stared directly at Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu just smiled like this, "That guy doesn't disappear so easily." Finally, Lin Yu told Susan everything about the strange woman who wanted to cooperate with them, and Susan also sighed quietly. "That's fine. I've known for a long time that the boss had a broken picture here, but at that time I thought that if I got this broken picture, maybe I could piece it together with the memory fragments in my dream, but now it seems that I don't need to. After all, it's better to have a real map than to have to piece it together myself." At this time, after Lin Yu heard Susan say this, he nodded gently. At this time, as if he suddenly remembered something, he turned his head towards Susan. Bien took a look. "There is something I want to ask you, and you must answer truthfully." Susan had never seen Lin Yu look so serious. At this time, she nodded gently, turned her head and looked at Lin Yu sincerely. "If you have anything to ask, just ask him, just ask, I will tell you everything you know." Lin Yu nodded solemnly. "Okay, actually I want to ask you what kind of relationship the William family has with this ancient battlefield of gods." If you can have such a dream, then it must mean that there is a certain connection between the William family and the ancient gods, am I right? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Susan. At this time, Susan was slightly stunned at first, but after a moment, she nodded lightly and smiled. You are really a smart guy. Yes, our William family is indeed connected to the battlefield of the ancient gods, but it would be troublesome to talk about this matter. Now let's find the boss and get the map. I will tell you slowly after we go back. How about it? After hearing what Susan said, Lin Yu nodded and smiled gently. In this case, it is naturally an honor. After hearing what Lin Yu said, Susan stared at Lin Yu with a smile on her face, not knowing what she was thinking at the moment. At this time, Lin Yu slowly walked towards the bar. He looked at them, and then came to the drunk driving behind the bar and fumbled a few times. After a bottle of Skylark whiskey, he touched something like a switch. At this time, he just flipped the switch gently, and then under the bar, the floor suddenly opened, revealing a hole that public welfare people could enter. When Susan saw this scene, a hint of excitement flashed in her eyes. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chang. Chapter 345. I didn't expect you to be able to find the secret door so easily. It's really amazing. Susan stared at Lin Yu with a smile on her face, and a few complex colors flashed in her eyes. At this time, Lin Yu heard that after Susan said this, she also waved so gently. He waved his hand and smiled. Actually, it's not bad. I'll go down to explore the road first. You follow me and don't get lost. Lin Yu was talking unhurriedly like this. After Sushan heard what Lin Yu said, she nodded heavily. At this time, Lin Yu just walked towards the ground. And when they walked through the wooden stairs, they found that the underground was astonishingly large, and there was no light in the underground. Susan's eyesight was not as good as Lin Yu's, and she was still a girl, so after seeing this after the situation, it is inevitable that there will be some panic in the heart. At this time, Susan was grabbing Lin Yu's sleeve like this, with a look of complete panic between the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. When Lin Yu saw Susan like this, he couldn't help but shake his head and smile. He just patted the back of Susan's hand gently. It's okay, don't be afraid, I'm here. These few simple words seemed to give Susan great encouragement. At this time, Susan nodded heavily. The two people walked forward cautiously. After passing through a long and narrow corridor, there was a door. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the door, and the corner of his mouth it also evoked a bit of a special smile. In this dim environment, after Susan saw Lin Yu's smile, she suddenly felt that this man seemed to be a little different. Her eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and he looked so, she took off her clothes like a little nympho. Lin Yu saw Susan like this and glanced in her direction. Is there something on my face? When Sushan heard what Lin Yu said, she quickly shook her head, and a blush instantly appeared on her pretty face. Susan was also very cute at this time, and Lin Yu's eyes also flashed a bit of intoxication, but after a while, Lin Yu came back to his senses, and he just smiled like this. If I guessed correctly, this guy should be behind this door now. At this time, Susan heard Lin Yu and frowned slightly after saying this. It doesn't look like there is an agency around here. How on earth should we get in? At this time, Lin Yu took a look at the stone door, which was made from a single huge stone. This stone door was extremely wide and thick, and it seemed that it was indeed not easy to open. An ordinary person would definitely be helpless about this, but this was not a difficult problem for Lin Yu, and a rather confident smile appeared on his lips. This matter is simple, just leave it to me. Lin Yu just spoke softly and unhurriedly. Although Susan was very curious about what methods Lin Yu would use, she did not ask Lin Yu so directly. At this moment, Lin Yu took a step forward, and softly uttered 3 words in his mouth, time and space beast. At this time, the space-time beast suddenly appeared in front of him. At this time, Susan's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. After a moment, she understood the clues. Susan nodded gently and smiled. I see, using the time-space beast can travel through time and space, so you can leave directly from here, which is really amazing. After Lin Yu heard what Susan said, he nodded gently and smiled. You are still smart, and you are indeed right. You can directly cross this door by using the time and space beast's ability to travel through time and space. Although it's not too difficult to open this door, it's not that simple after all. After Lin Yu finished speaking, with the thought in his mind, the time and space beast transformed and led the two of them directly through the gate. When Lin Yu passed through the gate, the man saw Lin Yu. In the corners of his eyes and brows, he was completely stunned. It was full of panic. At this time, the bar owner's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu discovered that the bar owner was covered in blood and had several wounds. Although they were not too fatal, but if he doesn't get medical treatment in time, the bar owner will definitely bleed to death over time. Lin Yu glanced at the bar owner, and finally shook his head slightly. Oh, what should I say to you? When the bar owner heard Lin Yu say this, a bitter smile appeared on the corners of his mouth, and there was a sense of helplessness in the corners of his eyes and brows. Everything is fate, you can't blame others, you can't blame others. When Lin Yu heard what the bar owner said, he just shook his head and smiled, and then walked towards the bar owner. At this time, he turned his head and glanced at the bar owner. Do you know that if your wound is not treated in time, you will die? After Thomas heard what Lin Yu said, there was clearly a hint of death in his eyes. There was also a wry smile on the corner of his mouth, and there was a complete helplessness in the corners of his eyes and brows. Meaning, if I had known that something like that would kill so many people, I would rather die in that place and never come out. If they really asked me for it from the beginning, I would definitely give it to them, but they wanted to kill me without saying a word. What do you think I did wrong? At this time, Thomas let out an angry roar, and his eyes were red, like an angry leopard. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu also had a bit of a wry smile at the corner of his mouth. There was a complete helplessness in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, he couldn't help but shake his head slightly. Everything is determined by fate, and everything is just like nature. Take it calmly and face it calmly. This is the only thing we can do. Lin Yu just spoke softly and unhurriedly, and Thomas also had a wry smile on his lips, and finally turned his head to look at Lin Yu. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 346. What you said is easy, but ask yourself if you can do this. Thomas's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu heard Thomas. After saying this, he didn't even hesitate. He just shook his head without any hesitation. To be honest, I admit that I can't do it. Thomas was far from expecting that Lin Yu would answer him like this. At this moment, Thomas opened his mouth and wanted to say something, but when the words came to his lips, he felt that he could not say anything. Then why are you trying to persuade me like this? Lin Yu rolled his eyes at Thomas angrily. Just because I advise you doesn't mean that I understand it myself. It's easy to persuade others, but if I understand it myself, it's very difficult, doesn't it? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Thomas, and a vague smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. At this time, after Thomas heard Lin Yu say this, a special color flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. At this moment, he couldn't help but raised his eyebrows slightly, and a moment later he also sighed quietly. Tone. Oh, what you said seems to be true. If I guessed correctly, you should be the one who killed me, and your purpose was just for that map, right? At this time, after Lin Yu had bandaged Thomas's wound, he stood up slowly. He heard Thomas talking and just wanted to speak, but before he could speak, Thomas spoke first. I will not give that thing to you, because you killed my people, and it is impossible for me to give that thing to a devil like you. What's more, I am the only one left now. You have nothing to threaten me with. But you still have your life, aren't you afraid of death? There was clearly a hint of death in Thomas's eyes, and his eyes became hollow, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. Actually, since you destroyed my bar, I was already dead at that time. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly smiled, with a hint of ridicule flashing in his eyes. If that's the case, then why did you escape to this place? Lin Yu's gaze was as blazing as a torch, and his eyes were fixed directly on Thomas, with a gloomy look flashing in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, Thomas suddenly laughed like this. He laughed very happily, as if he had encountered the funniest joke in the world, and kept laughing wildly. I said you were stupid, but I never expected that you were so stupid. The reason why you wanted to escape before was of course to destroy that thing. I just want to destroy the thing you are trying to get. Who told you destroyed all my most precious things? Thomas was a bit hysterical at the end of his speech, and the wound that had been bandaged suddenly opened like this. At this time, Lin Yu heard Thomas say this and frowned slightly. You are really a crazy guy. I can tell you clearly that I did not kill your people. After Thomas heard Lin Yu say this, a hint of ridicule clearly flashed through his eyes. At this time, a disdainful sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. Do you think I will believe you if you tell me this now? Thomas's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, his eyes full of cold murderous intent. Before Lin Yu could say anything, Susan took a step forward and came to Thomas. She turned her head and glanced at Thomas, her eyes full of sympathy. You don't believe him, can't you still believe me? At this time, Susan spoke directly. After Thomas heard Susan's voice, he raised his head and glanced in Susan's direction. At this time, Thomas's eyes and brows were filled with a look of disbelief. It was as if they were condensed together. Why are you? Yes, I did show you something like that back then. Could it be that you betrayed me? You must have betrayed me. Why don't you give my brother's life back? It was obvious that Thomas was a little crazy at this time. After Susan heard what Thomas said, a look of helplessness flashed in her eyes, and a wry smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. Do you think I might betray you? It's been so long. If I really want to do something to you, I don't have to wait until now. Susan's eyes were staring directly at Thomas, and Thomas was slightly hesitant at this time. How can I trust you? How can I trust you? At this time, Thomas's eyes were fixed on Susan's body. At this time, his voice actually trembled slightly. At this moment, after hearing what Thomas said, Susan also had a bit of a wry smile on her lips. I know you must be sad now, but I am also sad, but those murderers are very happy. If you give me that thing, I promise that after I come back from this battlefield of the gods, I will help you get revenge. Susan's eyes were full of determination. Thomas also knew how powerful Susan's William family was. He also knew that it was simply a fantasy to want revenge according to his current situation, but if he relied on the William family, there might be a chance. Tell me, can I still trust you? After Thomas finished speaking, his eyes were fixed on Susan, and Susan was stunned at first after hearing what Thomas said, and then nodded heavily, with a few points of determination flashing in her eyes. Believe me, you can believe me. Susan's eyes were fixed on Thomas, and Thomas laughed at this time after hearing what Susan said. Ha ha ha, fine, I'll trust you once again. If you dare to lie to me, I'll drag you down with me even if I have to go to hell. I swear. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 347. After Lin Yu saw this scene, the corners of his eyes and brows were full of surprise. He originally thought that Thomas, who had just suffered such a blow, would have a hard time convincing him to hand over the map. That's right. But what Lin Yu never expected was that Susan would directly deal with Thomas with just a few words. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes were staring directly at Susan, with a look of complete disbelief in the corners of his eyes and brows. Awesome, really awesome, I really admire you. At this time, after Susan heard what Lin Yu said, she was also so proud with her head raised, as if she were a general returning from victory. After Lin Yu saw this scene, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. At this time, Lin Yu turned around and glanced towards Thomas. Wait a minute, didn't you just say that you had destroyed the map? Susan was still in this joy, but after hearing what Lin Yu said, Susan's face was livid at that time. At this moment, Susan's eyes were staring directly at Thomas, with the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. A hint of anticipation flashed through his mind. Shouldn't you? At this time, Thomas gently waved his hand and smiled. He turned his head and glanced at Susan, with a meaningful smile on the corner of his mouth. I'm not a fool. How could I destroy such precious things? I just hid them. And like now, the things are not with me, but with a friend of mine. After Lin Yu and Susan heard what Thomas said, some complex colors flashed in their eyes. At this time, the two of them looked at each other. What? At your friend's place? Susan's voice was instantly several times higher than before. At this time, Thomas also smiled like this. My dear Miss Susan, don't worry about this matter, my friend is absolutely reliable, I can guarantee you. Thomas's eyes were staring directly at Susan, and a few meaningful smiles appeared at the corners of his mouth. At this time, after Susan heard what Thomas said, some complicated colors flashed in her eyes. But what we are worried about now is that those guys will find your friend. If this is the case, then your friend may be in danger now. Susan said in a deep voice. Thomas didn't seem to realize this at first, but after Susan finished saying this, Thomas's face suddenly turned ugly. No, it's impossible. Those people's hands shouldn't be so fast. At this time, after hearing what Thomas said, Lin Yu couldn't help but shake his head slightly, and then said in a cold voice. You underestimate those guys too much. Those guys are very well informed. It's not even an exaggeration to say that they have hands and eyes. Now hurry up and tell me the information about your friend. I will rush over now. If their actions are not if you go that fast, if your friend is lucky enough, you might even be able to save his life. At this time, Thomas heard what Lin Yu said and stared straight at Lin Yu, with a bit of hesitation flashing in the corners of his eyes and brows. After Lin Yu saw this scene, 3 black lines suddenly appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. He rolled his eyes at Thomas angrily. Don't hesitate now. If you hesitate any longer, I'm afraid your friend will really be hopeless. After a while, Thomas gritted his teeth. Okay, if that's the case, then I will trust you again. Xilan Street, number 57, Building C, 502. When you go there, give him something like this, and he will naturally understand what it means. I will naturally give you what you want. After Thomas finished speaking, he took off a pendant from his neck. The pendant was a bullet with a capital letter T engraved on it. After Lin Yu took the pendant, he nodded lightly. Okay, the space-time beast should be able to make it in time. At this time, Susan walked over to Lin Yu. Lin Yu glanced at Susan. It's very dangerous there. I'm afraid I won't be able to take care of you, so you should stay in this safe place for now. After Susan heard what Lin Yu said, she nodded slightly. A strange color flashed in her eyes. She seemed to have something to say, but when the words came to her lips, she couldn't. Don't know what to say. When Lin Yu saw Susan's hesitant look, he couldn't help but smile. and then came to Susan's side. He glanced in Susan's direction with concern. "If you have anything you want to say, just say it. There's no need to act like this." Susan gritted her teeth. "Be careful." Of course Lin Yu knew that this was definitely not what Susan wanted to say, but at this moment it was hard for him to pursue the question any further, so at this moment Lin Yu just nodded lightly and smiled. "Okay, don't worry, just leave this matter to me." After Lin Yu finished speaking, he turned around and left. At this time, Susan's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu's back. No one knew what Susan was thinking at this time. As long as we have these location coordinates, it is no problem for the space-time beast to travel through the space of several streets. And this time on Xyland Street, a group of guys wearing special robes began to slowly gather towards one place at the same time. The leader was a guy with an evil ghost mask on his face. The man raised his head and glanced at the tall building, with a very meaningful smile on the corner of his mouth. That guy Thomas is really a smart guy. He knew that he would definitely not be able to defend this map, so he placed this map with his companions in advance, and deliberately created a situation to cause trouble with his companions. It's an illusion, it's interesting, I haven't encountered such an interesting thing in a long time. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chong. Chapter 348. After the black-robed man said this, the smile on his lips became more and more obvious. It's a pity that the guy's cleverness backfired. He probably didn't expect what we did to find her out. At this time, another person wearing the same evil ghost mask, but whose figure could be vaguely seen as a woman, suddenly came to the black-robed man. After hearing what the woman said, the black-robed man also raised a bit of sneer at the corner of his mouth. If that guy really has such a brain, he probably doesn't have to hide now. The woman glanced at the black-robed man, and a bit of solemnity flashed in her eyes, but something happened in the middle. "That guy named Lin Yu is too tricky, so this time we must get the map before he arrives." The black-robed man nodded slightly. "Of course, this is no problem, just leave it to me." At this time, the black-robed man disappeared in front of the woman after he finished speaking. The woman's eyes stared straight at the back of the black-robed man, and a bit of extremely solemn colors flashed in her eyes. For some reason, the woman always felt that this matter seemed to be defeated by Lin Yu this time, because she had also seen the previous live broadcast. Lin Yu had at least 2 epic beasts in his hand. Of course, what she didn't know was that Lin Yu had more than just 2 epic beasts and a chaos-level white tiger. If women knew that Lin Yu had such a chaos-level beast, they wouldn't dare to provoke Lin Yu even if they had the courage. But that's all for later. At this time, the black-robed man was hiding in the darkness. He came here in advance and found the guy Thomas mentioned. "Mr. Charles, I think you shouldn't hide anymore. After all, you should know what you will end up with," the black-robed man said slowly, with excitement in his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, he was like a pervert, searching everywhere, with a mocking look in his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, the man in black robe came by himself, picked up a glass of red wine on the drunk driving, and then shook the glass of red wine gently, with a kind of excitement in his eyes and eyebrows. He took a sip of red wine gently, and then shook the glass gently, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "If you don't come out, don't blame me for being rude, my dear Mr. Charles." A middle-aged man wearing glasses couldn't help it after hearing what the guy said, so he walked out slowly. The middle-aged man's eyes were fixed on the man in black robe. When he saw the pattern on the man's robe, his face became ugly at that time, and his eyes and eyebrows were full of fear. At this time, Charles stepped back several steps before he managed to stabilize his body. He stared at the man. "Who are you? Are you from Yesi?" After hearing what Charles said, the man in black robe smiled teasingly, and then nodded gently. "Ha ha ha, you are such a smart guy. You can guess my identity so quickly. So, to reward you, I decided to give you a quick death. What do you think? At this time, the man in black robe stared at Charles, with a mocking look in his eyes and eyebrows, and a sneer at the corner of his mouth. At this time, Charles's eyes flashed with a few cold lights, and the murderous intent on his body began to become more and more obvious. Although I am very afraid of the organization YSE, I am not so weak that even the cats and dogs of YSE can threaten me. Charles's eyes were fixed on the black-robed man, and there was a gloomy murderous intent in his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, after hearing what Charles said, the black-robed man suddenly laughed. At this moment, he laughed loudly, and there was a hint of mockery in his eyes and eyebrows. Really? According to legend, Mr. Charles has an epic beast. This time, his strength is really strong, but Mr. Charles should also know me, black-robed butler, that means I have at least 2 epic beasts on me, so Mr. Charles, do you think you are my opponent? The black-robed man stared at Charles, and there was a hint of teasing in his eyes and eyebrows, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. At this time, Charles's fists were clenched so tightly that they made a clattering sound. He gritted his teeth and said, "Asshole, damn it." After hearing what Charles said, the black-robed man also laughed out loud. He seemed to be completely crazy at this moment, and the madness in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows was quietly revealed. Yes, we are all bastards, but Mr. Charles should know how we bastards do things, so Mr. Charles, would you consider cooperating with us? After hearing what the black-robed man said, Charles's eyes flashed with a few special colors, and then he turned his head and glanced at him coldly, with a few strange flashes in his eyes. What do you want? Tell me. The black-robed man laughed out loud, "Ha ha ha, it's very simple. I think you should have known the purpose of my coming now. If you hand over that thing obediently, maybe I can spare your life. Otherwise, don't blame me for being rude to you," the black-robed man said in a cold voice without hurry. After hesitating for a moment, Charles nodded gently, "I can leave it to you. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 349. When the black-robed man heard what Charles said, his eyes were fixed on Charles, and there was an expression of disbelief in his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, his eyes flashed with a bit of coldness, and the corners of his mouth also raised a bit of a faint smile. Is what Mr. Charles said true? You should know that we hate people who don't keep their promises the most. At this time, Charles just waved his hand lightly, "Wait for me for 10 minutes, or you can come with me to the basement." After Charles finished speaking, he turned around and walked back. The black-robed man stared at Charles's back. At this moment, he had no idea what Charles was up to. The black-robed man followed Charles carefully. At this time, he was already on high alert. If this old guy dared to have any improper thoughts, this black-robed man would definitely send this old guy to the west in the first place. Several people walked slowly towards the basement for a while. At this time, the black-robed man's face suddenly sank, and then, Charles felt a dagger against his neck. The black-robed man also sneered a little bit, and a few strange colors flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, and finally raised his eyebrows slightly. "Sir, I don't understand why you do this. What do you mean?" After hearing what Charles said, the black-robed man also sneered a little bit, and a cold light flashed in his eyes, and the murderous intent on his body quietly emerged. "Mr. Charles, I told you not to play any tricks with me, but you don't look honest. You have locked up a beast you raised in the basement. That beast is at least epic, so do I need to tell you your purpose?" Charles obviously didn't expect that the man in black robe would investigate him so thoroughly, but Charles was also an old hand. When he heard what the man in black robe said, a smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and then he stopped. At this time, Charles slowly turned his head and looked at the man in black robe, with a hint of playfulness in his eyes. "Sir, the premise of cooperation is mutual trust. If you don't believe me now, then I think we should just let it go for now. You can kill me or cut me up, what do you think?" Charles's eyes were fixed on the man in black robe, with a hint of playfulness in his eyes and eyebrows, and a hint of a meaningful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. At this time, the black-robed man heard what Charles said, and a bit of gloom flashed in his eyes. His eyes were fixed on Charles. At this time, he always felt that something was wrong with this matter, but he couldn't tell what was wrong. After a moment, the black-robed man suddenly laughed. "Of course I believe in Mr. Charles, so I won't say anything more this time. Mr. Charles, please." At this time, after Charles saw the black-robed man like this, a few meaningful smiles appeared on the corners of his mouth, and a very special color flashed in his eyes. At this moment, Charles nodded gently. "Okay, since you have said this just now, then you have to listen to me next." Although the black-robed man was also very angry at this time, he still forcibly suppressed the anger in his heart. He turned his head and looked at Charles, and then nodded gently. Of course, of course." The two continued to walk towards the basement for a while, and the black-robed man didn't know why, but he always had an ominous premonition in his heart. After the two of them walked down the ladder, the eternal lamp instantly illuminated their way. The black-robed man turned his head and looked at Charles at this time. "This doesn't seem to be a place where things can be hidden. I knew at the beginning that this thing was of extraordinary significance and value, so I put it here. There is also a strange beast I raised here. What you said is true, but all this is for the safety of the map," Charles said slowly, and the black-robed man at this moment, although he still had some doubts in his heart, his doubts were mostly eliminated at this time. At this time, the black-robed man nodded gently and smiled. "In this case, thank you very much, sir." And at this time, Charles seemed to suddenly remember something. He turned his head and looked at the black-robed man. "I'm afraid I'll have to borrow your hand to help me subdue that guy later, because I know that I'm not capable enough to protect this map, so I locked this guy who I can't control here." The black-robed man's eyes flashed with a bit of coldness, and then his eyes stared straight at Charles, with a kind of icy coldness in his eyes and eyebrows. "What do you mean by this? I don't understand it." Charles suddenly laughed. "Don't you understand? Because I didn't mean to take it out at the beginning. Now you should understand what I said." After hearing what Charles said, the black-robed man nodded gently, and then his eyes flashed with a bit of strange light. "So that's it?" When the two of them walked to a huge underground cage, the black-robed man saw a dark green toad lying in it. There were 2 rows of bone spurs on the back of the toad, and the bone spurs were emitting a light blue light. At this time, the toad seemed to be asleep. Even though the two of them had come to the toad didn't even look up at them. After seeing this scene, the black-robed man's eyes flashed with a bit of surprise. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 350. At this time, even the black-robed man would have a flash of solemnity in his eyes and eyebrows when he saw this Yinhan Cuba. Exotic Beast, Yinhan Bone Frog Epic Level 6, Level 49. Qualification, Alien, Intermediate. Life, 9999999999777. Speed, 9999999999777. Defense, 9999999999777. Attack, 9999999999777. Skills, unknown. Living in the center of the earth, never leaving the center of the earth, and later because of an accidental change, it was obtained by Professor Charles. The strength of this Yinhan bone frog seems to be more than epic, and then it is much stronger than the epic level. However, due to the intrusion of time, his strength is gradually weakening, and he has been sleeping all year round. I don't know the specific reason, but his strength is still weakening. Professor Charles can't find the reason, but he is trying his best to restrain it. At this time, Professor Charles looked at the Yinhan bone frog in front of him, and a few very special colors flashed in his eyes. Then he sighed heavily and raised a bitter smile at the corner of his mouth. Alas, this little frog was brought back from the center of the earth in this ancient ruins, but what makes me very strange is that the temperature of the center of the earth is so high, but the attribute of this Yinhan bone frog belongs to Yinhan, which has always puzzled me. The man in black robe looked at the Yinhan bone frog and couldn't help but take a breath of cold air. Some special colors flashed in his eyes. I don't know why he suddenly felt a sense of powerlessness in front of this Yinhan ancient frog. The man in black robe turned his head and looked at Professor Charles, and there was a rare solemnity in his eyes. Professor Charles, I really have no way to subdue this big guy. I wonder if Professor Charles has any way. Professor Charles spread his hands helplessly, and a bitter smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. Then he looked at the cold bone frog, and a bit of helplessness flashed in his eyes and eyebrows. If you have no way, then I am afraid I have no way either. After all, I didn't want to take that thing out at the beginning. Charles pointed to a small box in front of him. The small box was bound by a layer of energy shield in the middle. There seemed to be a code outside the energy shield. At this time, the black-robed man saw this scene, turned his head and looked at Charles, and a meaningful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. Professor Charles, do you have anything else to say? At this time, after seeing the black-robed man like this, Professor Charles suddenly had a bit of ominous premonition in his heart. He stared at the black-robed man with a vigilant look, and a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes. I don't understand what you mean by that. Can you explain it to me? At this time, the black-robed man, after hearing what Professor Charles said, had a bit of coldness in his eyes and eyebrows, and he slowly walked towards Professor Charles. Professor Charles, don't you know what I want to do? At this time, Professor Charles saw the black-robed man like this, and his face suddenly twisted, and a bit of gloom flashed in his eyes and eyebrows, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. You want to attack me, right? Professor Charles's eyes were burning, and the black-robed man laughed loudly after hearing what Professor Charles said. There was a bit of madness in his eyes, just like he was full of madness at this time. After seeing this scene, Professor Charles knew that he was in danger this time, but at this time, his face was quite calm. Do you have to kill me? Can't you let me go? Professor Charles sighed quietly, with a helpless look in his eyes. After waiting for a moment, Professor Charles seemed to have accepted his fate. He just shook his head helplessly. I personally think that you'd better not kill me before you get that thing. After the black-robed man heard what Professor Charles said, a strange look flashed in his eyes, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly, and his eyes stared straight at Professor Charles. Why do you say that? The black-robed man's eyes were burning, and his eyes were like two knives, trying to cut Professor Charles's face. At this time, Professor Charles smiled, and then spread his hands. It's just a personal suggestion. If you believe me, you'd better not kill me first. What if I don't believe you? The tone of the man in black robe suddenly became cold, and there was a cold light flashing in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, after hearing what the man in black robe said, Professor Charles spread his hands helplessly, and a bitter smile appeared on the corners of his mouth. If you don't believe it, what can I, an old man, do? Just do it. After hearing what Professor Charles said, the black-robed man had a murderous look in his eyes, and then he pulled out a dagger from his waist and stabbed it directly at Professor Charles's neck. His eyes were very cold, without any color, just like an emotionless killing machine. At this time, Professor Charles just closed his eyes, without any intention of dodging. However, when the dagger was about to fall on Professor Charles's neck, the black-robed man actually stopped his hand movements. At this time, he smiled slightly, and then turned his head, looked at Professor Charles, and gently patted Professor Charles's shoulder. "I was just joking with you just now. I believe you don't mind, right?" The black-robed man stared at Professor Charles, and at this time, although Professor Charles still didn't show any fear on his face, he was already extremely scared in his heart.